Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is the Final Say radio show, and I want to welcome our next guest, Dr. Tom Henriksen, who is a senior fellow, expert in U.S. foreign policy, international political affairs with the Hoover Institute. Dr. Henriksen, I want to welcome you to our program. It's a pleasure to have you join us today.
Oh, good afternoon. Thank you.
Well, we certainly love to discuss foreign affairs and policy on this radio program. It's really a passion of ours for many years. We discuss all issues in all areas, and it's very troubling to me, recent events. If you look at both parts of the Asian region and the Middle East, it seems like we've got so many different fires that are some are mild, some are growing in size. With looking at Syria today, it's very troubling. And I think what is most troubling is that I fear that we may or may not have the right leadership or be taking these threats and concerns as serious as we need to in today's time.
Well, I agree. What's I think happening might be interesting for you and some of your listeners. When an empire collapses, like the Soviet Union collapsed, or the Roman Empire, if we go back 2,000 years, there's going to be a lot of unsettledness for a long time, and that's what we're witnessing. I mean, we have a state, as you mentioned, Syria, which was a client of the Soviet Union and then shifted over to be a client of the Iranians, and it's in dire trouble right now, and it's that it could, in fact, what's happening there could spread to other areas such as Lebanon, even Turkey. And that will engulf that region in more fire and blood. So we're witnessing that. We're also big changes, as you alluded to, in the Asia theater. And so this is one of those periods, one of those hinge points in history, I think, that the diplomatic historians look back and say, evaluate. A lot of things happened. A lot of things broke loose from what they had been.
Yeah, I find it very interesting. You're absolutely correct. I view the changes in the Middle East as the rise of Iran, and I think we failed drastically in 2009, and for that matter, many years before that with our policy with Iran. But in 2009, they had the uprising there, where you had roughly 1 million people in the streets who were looking to change their government, whether it was good or bad. It certainly seems to me that it would have been more beneficial for us to have gotten involved in that situation than what we're looking at right now in Syria, or what we did in Libya, or what we did in Egypt, or any of the smaller countries in the region.
Absolutely. Looking at Iran back in 2009, when the Green Movement was challenging the theocracy there, that would have been a time for the United States to help. But that's what we were looking for. We've been waiting for something inside that would change Iran, that would spare us a great deal of trouble of attacking them or defending ourselves from them. In this constant turmoil, we've been in Iran since the overthrow of the Shah in 1979. So it was a huge missed point for us. And the Obama administration was so fixed on its rhetoric that somehow it could change these regimes simply by talking to them, by reaching out. And also, on top of that, just the idea we could maybe do a deal with Iran. And I think we should be disabused of that notion. We've certainly had lots of experience as a country dealing with Iran. We're always looking for moderates. We're always looking for reasonable people we can cut a deal with. And there hasn't been any, really, in the upper echelons of Iranian political elite to deal with. So we should have known better. Absolutely, we should have helped a great deal more.
Now, my greatest concern is the nation of Iran obtaining a nuclear bomb. Is this, not from our perspective, if you're the Soviet Union or China, is this something that they're interested in seeing, or is this something that they would like to deter? Whether or not they would say so is another story.
Well, I think in the case of China and in Russia both, they probably aren't wild by the prospect, because it does, it cuts into their nuclear monopoly. We have a nuclear monopoly, and so do the Soviets, and so do the Chinese. But on the other hand, I don't think they feel as threatened by Iran as we do. If one of their enemies, let's say, for example, Taiwan got the nuclear weapon in the case of China, or the Republic of Georgia got the nuclear weapon in the case of Russia, they'd be a lot more nervous. But since Iran really doesn't fall out with them, in fact, China buys a lot of oil from Iran, and China's had pretty good relationships with them. And Russia is a little different case. It's more complex. I mean, there has been tension between Russia and Iran over the centuries. But still, I don't think they fear them as much. The big imponderable for everybody is if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, and they certainly have nuclear capacity now, or if those elements, that material, is given or smuggled out to terrorists, then the world changes fundamentally. That's very serious for everybody, because the Chechens, who are fighting for their independence against the Russians, what if they got nuclear capacity? So no one is really safe with this stuff wandering around. It's like putting, guns in the hands of madmen.
I tend to agree with you, but it does beg the question that when we look especially at nuclear weapons, it often appears that both the Chinese and the Russians have it's almost like they're more desirous of seeing America weakened and seeing us, essentially losing certainly losing the trend line in the battle against the radical Islamist elements in the nations that support them. So it seems like that is almost a priority to them over the rational mindset, as you pointed out, of being safe themselves from nuclear weapons in rogue regimes. And one of the questions I would have for you is to maybe look at that from the perspective of, in my opinion, rogue regimes, and I'd love to hear you speak to this, are so dangerous because we already saw the result of 9/11, how difficult it is when you have stateless terrorists who perpetrate catastrophic evil, and if it occurs at a nuclear level, who do you go after? How do we recover from such an event? And I don't believe for a minute that if the Iranians get the bomb, that they won't end up handing that off to surrogates who would willfully use it against us or our allies.
Well, I think that's all true. The idea that sometimes your enemies are so gleeful, and that's what they are. When we're confronted with a state like Iran, they feel somewhat safe. I mean, I'm sure both in Beijing and in Moscow, they're a little apprehensive of terrorists getting nuclear weapons. But on the other hand, they're more focused on that because they're more delighted because we're really the ones in the crosshairs of most of the terrorists. Or we're the ones most upset. For example, I'll give you outside the Middle East. I think sometimes North Korea, which is also a rogue state, has nuclear capacity and makes no bones about it. They are a somewhat difficult ally for the Chinese from time to time. They do things the Chinese would rather have them not do. On the other hand, there's elements within the Chinese government that are very, very happy to see us confronted by North Korea, particularly when we sell arms to Taiwan, because it's sort of a way to pay back. It's sort of a way to sort of bother us, to twist our tail or to pull our feathers a bit. It's a way to get back. And so it overcomes their good sense sometimes that this is not a good thing to have unstable states with nuclear weapons on your borders. But the human mind is funny that way. It sometimes picks up on what is perceived as not so big a problem for itself, but for someone else. So I think sometimes a perception in Moscow and Beijing is these cause us more problems than they do them. But they do cause them problems.
Well, we see what happened in Colorado with an unstable guy with just a small handgun. We can only imagine what happens with rogue states when they have such weapons. And frankly, I think the only reason that North Korea has been behaving is because of the influence of China. At some point, I don't know that these nations can maintain that kind of control over Iran as they can, more for religious differences, if not anything else, as they can over, say, North Korea.
Well, that's true. I mean, the Iranians always disliked the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union under Marxism was a so-called godless state. Marx didn't acknowledge any sort of religious belief and thought it was the opium of a people. It detracted them and numbed them from their real grievances, and they should become communist Marxist. But so there was always that feeling of tension there. And there has been other tensions between Iran and and Russia over borders. I mean, the Russians have had this sort of for a long time, since Catherine the Great at least, the idea that they could have a warm water port. Well, Iran stands in the way of that if they went south. Now, that's probably never going to happen, but it still makes the Iranians nervous, and it's still a kind of idea floating around in some skulls within the Kremlin, that they could somehow move southward, or at least contain it. But the world is very complex, and sometimes the things you set out to do don't happen the way you want them to. And I think that states like China and Russia have to be very, very careful of this.
Well, we've spoken many times on this show, and one of the reasons we like to focus on foreign policy is because we think it's the area where Americans tend to have the least amount of education, but in my opinion, the thing that actually affects them often more than domestic affairs. And one of the things that concerns me greatly is I believe we have a commander-in-chief that really does not understand, because I don't think it's all a master plan as many people do. I think he truly does not understand, as a community organizer, the ramifications, the global political ramifications of the unintended consequences of the actions he takes. And I think we're paying a price for it, and may for decades to come.
I agree. And I think also there's this belief that, and this is Obama in some respects, and some Americans, other Americans as well, if we just sit down with people at a table, we can work out our differences. Now, that's true when you're dealing with people in the United States who share some certain values, and we can many times sort out a problem between us. If not, we can go to court and get it settled that way, peaceably. But on the international scene, that's very dangerous to think that way, because these people don't think the same way as you and I do. We could work out a disagreement, probably in a very amicable way, and both of us would walk away happy. We got at least part of the bargain. But when you're dealing with people that really just detest you, hate your values, then it's a different deal. They're not as interested in making peace, and they're more willing to take the longer view, to play it out a little longer. We're a little too impatient sometimes. We want things over at the end of the hour or end of the movie, and for them the movie doesn't end; it just keeps going.
Now, Dr. Henriksen, I'm very excited about your new book, America and the Rogue States, and it ties in the discussion we're having, and you've gone in a great length to discuss, well, all the states that we're always discussing, unfortunately, the big players such as Iran with Korea and Iraq before we had gone in and intervened there, and smaller players such as Cuba, Libya, and Syria. And I'm sure there's many more to list. And could you tell us a little more, in looking at your book, what, outside of Iran, which we've discussed, what are the biggest threats that we're facing right now?
Well, as you mentioned, North Korea is an unstable country with nuclear capacity. Iraq is no longer, it was one of the foremost of the three. It was in some ways worse than the others for a time as far as a rogue state, but it's no longer a rogue state now. It's bordering on perhaps a failed state. The other states have somewhat, and one of the things I mentioned in the book is rogue states are not particularly stable countries or stable areas. They do collapse. I mean, Libya, for example, was no longer a rogue state by the time Gaddafi was overthrown. He had opened up his arsenals to international inspection. He did have some nerve gas and some mustard gas left, but in relatively small quantities. Cuba is no longer the threat it posed during the Soviet era. But on the other hand, there may be other rogue states surfacing. I mean, some people would say, well, Pakistan. If Pakistan's government changed drastically, I mean, it does have nuclear weapons. If it became under the control of Islamicists, extreme people with extreme views, then it becomes a rogue state. Myanmar, Burma, also was one of those countries that didn't become a rogue, but certainly flirted with it. Venezuela, not quite a rogue, but it does have certain roguish tendencies. So I think one of the messages that came out in the book was that rogue states come and go, but they're going to somewhat always be with us. And they change. Some collapse, but others could rise up.
Now, it begs the question of how important is it, one, that not just that we have a president who could demonstrate leadership, but how important is it as a nation that we have a very clear and consistent foreign policy in dealing with the issue? As you say, we're always going to be dealing with rogue nations. how important is that consistency?
Well, I think it's very important. One of the things we have to have a policy that is very firm. There's certain red lines we're not gonna have them pass over. And it's not a good idea in Washington to say that it's unacceptable for Iran to have nuclear weapons and don't do anything. It would be much better not to say anything. It's not a good idea to make threats you can't in fact enforce. That's one thing, a consistent policy, things we're going to do. And we have to remember we need a strong military, and we need a kind of different kind of military. We can't just rely on the Marines and the Army. We need a good, strong Navy, and we need an Air Force, and we need a missile defense system. These things are things we're going to need in the world. So I think those are investments we can't afford to let go. So we need a strong military defense, as well as a kind of consistent policy, and don't make idle threats if we're not willing to really carry them out.
Sure. Doctor, do you have a few more minutes to stay with us? Or?
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to. In looking at the policy, we see right now that through the process of sequestration, which is shameful that is the way we came about the defense cuts. Do you see only the first $500 billion that we've cut, but roughly another $600 billion is going to be cut? Do you see this as a threat to the policy and to what you've discussed here in your book in dealing with the rogue nations?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I was just saying. Are there things that we could do to try to minimize the? Obviously, it's going to be hard to deal with the threats with the reductions, but are there things that we could do to minimize the impact?
Well, I think the actual cuts that they're carried out, and let's hope they're not, that they'll be changed or at least modified or spread out over a longer period of time, because they will impact probably something, not just numbers of personnel in all the military forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, but in also cutting back on weapons systems and also research. I mean, obviously we have to do these things better. We have to save money in the military. We have to make sure the weapon systems don't keep having cost overruns. Those are things that are better, and I think there are people working on that, and they may get better. But nonetheless, defense is a kind of necessary thing. It's saved us in the past, and the times we have dropped our guard, such as the run-up to World War II, when we were just about naked in terms of military defense, it cost us dearly. And we've also learned in other wars as well. If we're not prepared, then a lot of young men and women die, and as a nation, we suffer humiliation.
Is it more beneficial as a nation to try to have a consistent budget for the military? In other words, in today's dollars, if we were to say spend $500 billion a year, if that were the number, which isn't necessarily the number, but if you had a consistent number as opposed to going from 5 to 600 down to 400, would that be more beneficial going forward?
Yeah, that's very interesting. There have been people that argued we should spend roughly 4% of our GDP toward keep it pretty consistent. Now, during World War II, the last year of World War II, we got up to 37%. In 1944, that was huge, and it spiked also in the Korean War. It got up to about 11%. That was in the early 1950s, and even in the Vietnam War, it went up quite a bit. And then afterwards, there's always that sudden fall off. We completely demobilize forces after virtually every war we've had, including the Cold War. We cut the Army. Just to give you one example, we cut all the forces, but the Army after the Cold War, say it ended in 1991, went from 18 divisions down to 10. That's huge. That's 40% cut. Now, the Marines were cut some, the Navy was cut, and the Air Force. They were all cut back, and that proved very costly when we had to face the Iraq War. We had 10 Army divisions, and we know the strain that put on a few number of people, both their home life, their mental health, the fact that we're facing these terrible problems of stress within the military forces is due in part because we didn't have a larger force that could rotate more, and we put the same young men in the battlefield time after time.
We had a discussion last week on the show with Congressman Steve King and Phil Rowe discussing the funding of the military. And what we had mentioned is the fact that we know as a nation that we've exhausted and overused the members of our National Guard in all the states, that our military is already small enough where we've got to call on those people, that the fact that we're looking at a reduction in roughly another 100,000 troops from all the forces, it seems to me like that's not a rational decision.
No, I think it isn't. Not in the kind of world we live in today. When you opened this segment, you talked about all the problems we're facing in the Middle East and Asia, and we know we can just sense that we're on the precipice of something big happening with the Middle East being engulfed. We don't have any idea we might have to send troops. We don't want to. No one in America really wants to do that, but we don't know if we'll have to do that in some region. Either secure the weapons in a place like Syria, for example, or some other activity, and the same in the Pacific region. It's a very unstable world, and unfortunately, sometimes our allies don't come through, and so we're left carrying the burden.
Yeah, that's actually rather unfortunate, and I don't see that improving actually with the. I mean, I know we've got our debt issues, but certainly you've got too many states within Europe that are near failing. Perhaps. Actually, here's a question for you. In looking at the growth of China and what they're doing with all their, whether it be their space program or their growing Navy or their expansion into South America or Central America or the Middle East, would it make sense for us to even make it appear that we were considering to put more weapons into Japan or Vietnam or the Philippines or some of those countries?
Well, I
or is
think
that just an escalating problem?
Well, we are doing some of that now. I mean, but it happened well before President Obama announced the so-called pivot, where we were going to shift from the Middle East, which I think was an unfortunate turn of phrase because it makes a pivot implies you're turning away from something, and yes. I don't think we in fact can do that. We can rebalance, perhaps, is a better term if you want to have one single term. We've been doing that, I think, since the 1990s. We've been moving submarines, for example, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. We built up the island of Guam a great deal, lengthened runways, built more barracks, and we have been moving forces that way for some time, partly to balance North Korea. But that's been undergone, and I do think it's a good idea for us not to look too weak or vulnerable, because I think we don't have to necessarily rattle sabers, but we have to in fact have enough forces where people aren't tempted or think we're weak or vulnerable. And the other thing is, getting back to your idea of consistent policies, we don't want to ever appear too weak or too willing to cave in, because that encourages your adversaries to take advantage of you, to think they can score a quick point on you, and they might do something foolish. It's better to be somewhat strong, because then they'll hesitate a little bit more. That's what deterrence is all about, is deterring the other side from fighting. And that's one of the missions of the military force, not just to fight wars, but to deter wars, and people don't think about that much. That's why you have a military. It's not just to fight wars; it's to stop wars from even starting.
Well, you made a good point, and you point out in your book that these problems exist all over the world. And one of the very frustrating things to me was the whole concept of the peace dividend. I thought it was very foolish, because clearly there was already problems occurring, rogue regimes and failed states and other things around the world. And the way I would sum up the point I hear you making is that these are problems that are just sort of rolling waves, right? It's not necessarily the same country in perpetuity, but you're constantly going to face both existing and new and evolving threats, and you have to be on a ready war footprint to deter and to be willing to address on short notice current conflagrations and anything new that might conceivably pop up, and to not be ready. Personally, I think is very foolish and failing at one of the most important constitutional foundations, which is to protect and defend this nation first and foremost.
Yes, if anyone looks just at history of the 20th century, or even history back, war is endemic. It's part of human society. We may not like it, We don't like cancer either, but you have to realize that it's part of human society, it's part of human history, and inevitably some power will try something. It might be in a regional power, smaller power, or it might be a greater power, one of the great powers, the major powers. But nonetheless, this is a fact. And to ignore that fact, to just say, oh, well, we've simply solved all the world's problems, we'll rely on the United Nations, we'll rely on our largest to give people things, we'll make a more peaceful world, we'll and try to convert everybody into Jeffersonian democracies and provide a better standard of living, and all our problems be over. That's simply very naive, in my opinion.
Yeah, Dr. Henriksen, you make a good point, but I wanted to add something to this conversation and get your opinion on it. One of the concerns that I have is, besides the fact that I do believe we often place too great a burden on both our men and women in service, as well as the equipment from a numerical perspective, from a readiness perspective, I think when we look at the application of force, it always concerns me greatly when we use force in a way that is sort of slow, half-committed, and allows our men and women to be sort of picked off over a long period of time, instead of, war is ugly. There's nothing ever pretty or nice or calm about war. And in my opinion, when war has to be applied, it should be quick, mean, nasty, and holistic, and end as quickly as possible. And we often, I don't think we have enough conversation about get the brutality over with. And I think if we serve, in my opinion, if we serve notice in that capacity, we will make war far less desirable on others, and hopefully prevent wars and reduce the overall atrocities on both sides that will occur when wars become necessary.
Well, I think you're right. There's been a tendency, it was noticeably and actually tracked by a lot of people in the Vietnam War. We had this sort of incremental response, the slow build-up, the slow gradual tightening of a noose. And some of that still prevails. And you recall a few years back, the Powell Doctrine. This was Colin Powell's idea, but you have to use overwhelming force. Now, there were lots of other ramifications of that, but using a lot of power works. I mean, when you really pulverize the other side, you really beat them down, they don't come back as quickly. And the examples of that are both Germany and Japan. That was a punishing war. I mean, we really unleashed military power on those countries, but it did end. And sometimes there's a little tendency to fight wars sort of humanely or politically correct, or fight them to in a way that we won't be bothered with the CNN factor. Remember, the CNN factor was the idea that televisions would go in and, they would show American troops doing things that were quite rough. And we have to worry about that. There was always this kind of politically correct notion, and I do think it does lead to problems. And it's even more restrictive down on the rules of engagement, the ROEs for a soldier or Marine who's in Afghanistan, when they can fire the weapon, when they cannot. And they're very restrictive, and you'd think these are combat situations, but sometimes they are restricted.
And I think
sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. We sometimes talk over each other. Well, Dr. Henriksen, we really enjoyed this conversation with you. I want to give one more plug to your book here. And where could people find a copy of your book?
The title is American Rogue States, and it can be gotten at in bookstores, but obviously most people go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or one of the online services, and that's best. It's in paperback, and it's not too long. I try to write it in an accessible way and not make it too long, so people would have the major issues, but not be overburdened.
Well, that's great. Well, again, we love to discuss foreign policy on this program.
Happy to do it. Glad to join you anytime.
We could probably go 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on these issues, and we'd probably enjoy doing it, in fact. So again, I want to thank you, Dr. Henriksen, with the Hoover Institute, for joining us here on the Final Say radio show. It would be great to have you back sometime.
Oh,